or as we discussed in the email previously, I just wanted to get in contact because I know a lot of what the Forge was a good example of a site which was discussing RPG design and theory, and I hadn't really noticed anything else since then aside from the depth play and a couple of other bits and pieces. And I just thought it'd be beneficial to get in contact with you to try and discuss the articles, and then you recommended an interview, which I agreed would be a great thing to do, because I believe that you would have a lot of insights to share in regards to the medium.
I hope so. Well, first, let's clarify a bit of the history, which is not very clear from sources on the internet. Um, First of all, the Forge operated from about 2000 to about to 2012, and so the you mentioned that you thought of it as sort of a design theory site, but that actually was just one of the activities. The primary issue for the Forge was to promote creator ownership.
Yeah.
So that's the big issue. And so one thing it wasn't, and I think that this has been a big misrepresentation, was that it represented a favored area of design, that there was a design type, that there's such a thing as a Forge game, that there was something that was promoted there as a way to play and as a way to
Yeah.
design. None of this is true. There were uh, identifiable emergent groups, like as you would find in any kind of situation like that. People would find each other, they would find each other's ideas compatible, and then they would design accordingly. There were a number of people who explicitly said this is a design conversation. So as long as we're talking, any of us can run off and make something. And so they often influenced each other a lot. So for people in that situation, you would find community oriented mutual attention efforts. And it's no surprise that you would see some commonalities among those games. But those are only small knots or small sections within a much, much broader array of design and influence, because the Forge didn't actually promote one way to do it. Any number of people showed up, benefited from what was there, and went off to design their own things that had nothing to do with anything that are currently called or came to be called Forge games. I'm saying the term Forge game was a misnomer. That there wasn't a favored way to play, a favored way to design. Does that make any sense?
Yep, that makes perfect sense. I noticed that when I encountered not so much your articles, which I've read, and I found them to be quite insightful, looking into potential ways of designing around games. I have noticed that a lot of online discussions has seemed to push that line that you were saying was a misconception about the Forge.
Right. Well, it was very.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's very.
I could go on and on about how that came about, but that's not probably very important for you. So go on. What did you have in mind next, or what was the thought?
Just that. So would you say then that you said the primary goal for the Forge was about ownership of the games you create, and I believe that has something to do with your own experiences creating Sorcerer RPG.
Well,
is that right?
certainly. I mean, certainly that's true. I was heavily influenced by the independent comics movements of the 1990s, and their reasoning in terms of distributorship the current situation for distributorship served no constructive purpose at all. It wasn't even good for what they called the industry or anything like that. It was just a mess. And the same thing applied to role playing games in a much smaller, more hobbyist way. And in fact, it was really broken. It's very difficult to describe to people now. The internet existed by the mid 90s as we know it, but it didn't have any of the shape that we currently think of as the internet. And internet commerce was incredibly primitive by modern standards. So therefore, it was not a small thing to say we can use this internet thing for distributing our own work under our own control. That sounds like a completely obvious thing that anybody would have done from today's perspective. In 1999, I can tell you it was not. Very, very few bands were doing this. Only very big name, very properties or property owners who were considered to be genuinely quirky leaders, David Bowie, the Grateful Dead, only people like that were releasing their own music for their directly to the consumers. And it was so people were not releasing albums on the internet. People were not publishing books on the internet. People were not selling shirts on the internet. So if you can kind of imagine an internet where that's not happening and advertisements for it are not present, which is probably kind of difficult to imagine, that's the circumstance in which I was saying we need to own our own work and we need to distribute it our way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would agree that it's probably a bit hard to imagine having grown up primarily with that.
Right. Well, you know what you guys call the dark web?
Yes.
That's the internet, from my perspective.
Right.
That's the internet. There is no platform, right? There is no notifications. It's not hooked to your email. It's not. You don't have a phone. There is no phone.
Yeah. So, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's still hard. I mean, I still say, hey, go to my URL, and people are like, what the hell is that? You know, what do you mean go somewhere? I sit here. Everything comes to me. So it's I'm old, you know, it's pathetic. I agree. It's pathetic. But that's
fine, it's understandable.
But that's the situation in which the Forge was formed. So cool. If there's something else, let's go ahead. Go ahead.
Would you argue that or say that, do you think the Forge had played a significant role in developing the indie movement, specifically online anyway?
Well, I would. Okay, it may be difficult. Obviously, I have a self-interest in answering positively. But but in an attempt, if at all possible, I'll try to attempt to get around that. If we're talking about the goal, which was to have choices about how you wanted to publish a game physically, and to benefit financially, and if you were going to enter into commerce, to recognize that that was a choice too. You don't have to enter into commerce if you don't want to. We don't have to define the activity of role-playing or even the activity of designing games as primarily a commercial effort. We don't have to do that. And so to get across that idea and to say whatever choices you want to make about it, you can do it the way you want. All of that has succeeded. By 2012 or earlier, even by 2007, I would say, that had occurred. All of the things that I talked about happened. PayPal was invented. Cafe Press was invented. Lulu.com was invented. Amazon expanded so that you could sell your own things. Those are just a few, and there are many others that, you know, all of the secondary or parallel or all sorts of things had occurred. Digital print. In 1999 to 2007, the shift from offset printing, which is an extremely high-tech, well, very high-tech in terms of mechanics, very low-tech because it's not digital. But offset printing shifted to digital printing. And there was a transition where early digital printing was very shitty looking. So we went through that transition, and by 2007, digital print was, I mean, when I tried to use my old printer, they said, oh, we do digital now, which is fine. I mean, I didn't mind, but the point is that until even 2 or 3 years before that conversation, they all would have died on the hill, right, to protect their old way. So that transition occurred. One might say that given all of those transitions, which obviously occurred without me, that the shift to a broad understanding in the hobby that you can design the game you want to design, that you can produce it the way you want to produce it, and you can distribute it and or sell it the way you want to. One could argue that all of that would have happened anyway. One could say that the Forge was just an artifact of the transition and that it all would have been the same.
Right. Okay.
Now that may or may not be true. One of the things that is difficult also to get across was the extreme institutionalization of role-playing publication by the mid-90s. For a number of reasons, it was deeply, deeply difficult to consider anything but a highly funded, usually through venture capitalism or inheritance, a highly funded advertising-driven campaign through the industry, as in America, as they called themselves, which meant reliance on a single distributor. There were a few distributors, but only one that really mattered. And so you had to basically become blessed by all of these little organizations, which really amounted to a few, gamers each. I mean, one thing that was really shocking to anybody who started to publish role-playing games was how trivial the so-called industry really was. I mean, it was really just a few gamers. And so, what do you mean?
What do you exactly? Sorry to.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you mean by
what
that?
I mean
Sorry.
in a couple of ways. Well, first of all, distribution of games to game stores. Okay, game stores and comic book stores had more or less blended, and so the distributor that handled the shipping of games to the stores, and the only thing that the stores really contacted, was called Alliance. And Alliance is tightly allied with the infamous or famous comics distributor called Diamond. So this one entity handled basically the distribution of comics and games everywhere. And so if you didn't get bought by them, if they weren't buying your games really weren't going to be distributed in any meaningful way. And the way distribution money worked is that if it didn't benefit the distributor, they wouldn't reorder your games, and they benefited from bulk sale and repeated sale and high profit margins. So high production value, massive advertising driven penetration, so that the distributor could tell the retailers this game is popular. The retailers would therefore order it from the distributors. Now they would say, oh, look, the retailers are ordering it, so it's popular. So it was very incestuous. It had nothing to do with contact with the games by customers. It's a perfect example of the mythology of the market. The idea is, well, if everybody likes it, then they'll get wanted at the stores. The stores will turn around and go to the distributors and say, oh, we want that game, believing that the customers are pushing the process, right? The classic market thinking. This is bullshit. It's all supply side, right? So
Yeah,
you have that was going on, and notice that they wanted bulk profit per unit. So that meant the game books get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? Between 1987 and 1997, the size of a core book easily quintupled, and quite likely more. Right? If you look at all the old games from the 70s and the 80s, you'll be shocked at how thin the core books are. You'll look at it and say, wait a minute, this is a medium-sized supplement. What the hell is that? Right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that bloat was a strict function of the needs of the middlemen. And so there were many, many things, but the most important part was to play in this game, you had to believe it. You had to believe that this was the industry. You had to say words like industry standard and the customers want and all sorts of bullshit.